Story 1. The Whispers in the Woods. Eliza grew up near the woods, but she was warned never to go too far in. There were stories, passed down through generations, about people who wandered too deep and were never seen again. No one could explain what happened to them, but some said you could hear them whispering if you stood at the edge of the forest during the dead of night. As a child, Eliza believed the tales were meant to scare her, but when her father disappeared 10 years ago on one of his hunting trips, her belief shifted. He had always been cautious, never straying too deep into the unknown parts of the woods. The search parties found no trace of him except for his rifle, neatly leaning against a tree, just a mile from home. Now, as an adult, Eliza found herself drawn to the woods. After years of wondering what had happened, she couldn't help but feel the urge to seek answers. The pull became stronger, especially after her mother passed away, leaving her alone in the old house. One evening, unable to resist, she grabbed her jacket and ventured toward the trees, determined to uncover the truth. As she crossed the tree line, the air grew cooler, and the familiar rustling of the leaves became unnerving. She felt as if she was being watched. But still, she pushed forward, her father's face flashing in her mind. After walking for what felt like hours, she reached a clearing she had never seen before. In the center of it stood an old, decrepit cabin. The door creaked as she pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick with decay, and an eerie silence filled the room. Her heart raced as she noticed the strange symbols etched into the walls. They seemed to pulsate, almost alive. Suddenly, she heard a soft whisper. At first, she thought it was the wind, but the words became clearer. She spun around, but no one was there. The voice grew louder, more insistent, calling her name over and over. Panic set in as she stumbled back, knocking over a chair. It was then that she noticed something horrifying. In the far corner of the room was a mirror, and reflected in it wasn't her own face, but that of her father. His eyes were wide, filled with terror. He mouthed something, but no sound came. She felt her legs move on their own, dragging her closer to the mirror. The whispers became deafening, and as her fingers touched the cold glass, a force yanked her through. Eliza found herself standing in a world that was not her own. The woods were darker, twisted. The trees towered above her like looming figures, their branches curling into grotesque shapes. And all around her, she could hear them, the whispers. Voices of those who had disappeared, trapped in this place, calling for help, but it was too late. She had joined them. Story 2. The man at the window. Sophie lived on the 3rd floor of an old apartment building in the heart of the city. Her job kept her out late most nights, and she had grown accustomed to the quiet solitude of her late-night return home. The apartment itself was small but cozy, with a large window that overlooked the street below. One night, after a particularly long shift, Sophie came home exhausted. She threw her bag on the couch and collapsed onto her bed without even bothering to change. The dim light from the street lamp outside seeped into her room, casting strange shadows across the walls. She had just started to drift off when she heard a soft tapping at the window. It was slow, deliberate, like someone gently knocking. Startled, she sat up and stared at the window. From where she was lying, she could see nothing outside but the faint glow of the streetlight. Still, the tapping continued. Her heart raced as she approached the window. The rational part of her brain insisted it must be a branch or perhaps a bird, but as she drew closer, she saw it, clear as day. There was a man standing outside her window, peering inches, her breath caught in her throat. He was impossibly tall, his face pale and expressionless. His eyes, dark and hollow, stared directly at her. What chilled her most was not just the fact that he was on the 3rd floor, but that he was standing there as if it were the most natural thing in the world. She froze, too terrified to move, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. Then, without warning, the man smiled, a grotesque, too wide grin that sent waves of terror down her spine. He raised his hand, and the tapping resumed. Desperate to get away, Sophie stumbled back and ran into the bathroom, locking the door behind her. She grabbed her phone and dialed 911, her hands shaking uncontrollably. When the operator answered, she tried to explain the situation, but as she spoke, the tapping grew louder. It was no longer just at the window. It was on the walls, the door, everywhere. Her blood ran cold as she realized the sound wasn't just outside. It was coming from within the apartment. She clutched the phone, too scared to make a sound, as the tapping became erratic, like frantic knocking. Then, as quickly as it had started, the noise stopped. Silence filled the air, and she heard the faintest creak of the floorboards outside the bathroom. Slowly, she approached the door, pressing her ear against it. There was nothing but stillness. After what felt like an eternity, she summoned the courage to open it. The apartment was exactly as she had left it. No sign of the man. She cautiously approached the window again, but there was no one outside. Her rational mind tried to convince her that it was a hallucination, the result of too little sleep and too much stress. But deep down, she knew what she had seen, and then, she heard it. A soft whisper, coming from behind her, "See you tomorrow. Store 3. The dollmaker's curse. In a small town nestled between the mountains, there was a toy shop that had been around for as long as anyone could remember. The shop was famous for its handcrafted dolls, and each one drove you to do details that they almost looked fun. The shop's owner, Mr. Coleman, was a quiet man who rarely interacted with anyone beyond selling his wares. The townsfolk often wondered about the secret behind his doll-making skills. His dolls were unlike any other, each seemed to possess a lifelike quality that made them both fascinating and unsettling. Children loved them, and both often found themselves avoiding the shop, especially after dusk. One evening, a young woman named Claire moved into town and, out of curiosity, visited the shop. She had always been fascinated by dolls and wanted to see Beaumont's creations for herself. As she entered the dimly lit store, the air was thick with the scent of varnish and sawdust. Dolls of all shapes and sizes lined the shelves, their glassy eyes staring down at her. Beaumont, a frail-looking man with silver hair and cold eyes, greeted her with a nod. Claire felt a shiver run down her spine but brushed it off as nerves. She wandered through the store, admiring the craftsmanship of the dolls, until one in particular caught her eye. It was a small girl doll, dressed in a Victorian gown, with dark, curly hair and eyes that seemed almost human. "Isn't she beautiful?" Beaumont's voice startled her. She hadn't noticed him approach. "She's special. Made her myself, just like all the others." Claire nodded, though she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling growing inside her. Despite her reservations, she decided to buy the doll and took it home. That night, she placed the doll on her dresser and climbed into bed, but sleep wouldn't come. Every time she closed her eyes, she felt as though someone was watching her. Eventually, she gave up and turned on the light. To her horror, the doll was no longer on the dresser. Her breath quickened as she scanned the room, and then she saw it, sitting on the edge of her bed, staring at her with those lifelike eyes. Frozen in terror, Claire slowly reached out to touch it, but as soon as her hand made contact, the doll's head turned sharply toward her. Its eyes blinked. She screamed, throwing the doll across the room. It hit the wall with a thud, but before she could react, she heard a faint voice. "Why did you do that?" it whispered. Claire ran out of the room and didn't stop until she was outside. She spent the night at a friend's house, too scared to return. The next day, she went back to the toy shop to confront Beaumont, but the store was closed. Curious, she asked around town and discovered something chilling. Mr. Beaumont had died years ago. The shop had been abandoned ever since. When she returned home, the doll was gone. But every night, she still hears it whispering her name, waiting for the moment she lets her guard down.